Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of Remnant Radio. My name is Joshua Lewis, and today I've got Sean McDowell on the other line, and we're going to be discussing the fate of the apostles, discussing their martyrdom, and the history surrounding this. You guys stay tuned. It's going to be a great episode. You are watching The Remnant Radio, a crowd-funded show where we interview pastors, teachers, historians, and theologians from different churches and denominations. My name is Joshua Lewis, and this is my co-host, Michael Roundtree. Together, we want to help you break outside of your theological echo chambers. If you're interested in learning about history, theology, or the gifts of the Spirit, this is the show for you. Okay, guys, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Remnant Radio is an entirely crowd-funded ministry, so if you're blessed by the ministry, we ask that there's a couple ways you can give down in the links of the description. You give there on PayPal or Patreon. Lots of cool stuff on Patreon. We got a book club. We're going through Walter Martin's Kingdom of the Cults. We just finished out the Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Science. This week, we're going through the Mormonism chapter, so pick up that chapter, read it this week, hang out with us on Saturday to discuss that content. We also had someone just come in, film some extra content with him that'll be going up on Patreon this week as well. Michael, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well, man. Doing well. We just filmed a Patreon episode from a friend named Jeff. He's got a Reformed Calvinist background, and he went to Bethel Church in Reading, and we were just kind of curious about it. And he and I had been talking, and he's very theologically minded. But we decided we started to have a conversation. We're like, let's just record the conversation because we'd had some concerns about Bethel, and at the same time, he's theologically minded. So we're like, what's going on? So we just had the conversation about hour long, at least, on
almost an hour 15.
Yeah, on Patreon. So we'll be posting that video here pretty soon. So make sure you sign up for Patreon and get that extra content.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Before we dive into the content, you want to let us know about some of the shows we get coming out?
Yeah, sure. We
Tons
have
of stuff.
tomorrow we have Joel Webbin coming on, and he's the guy who did the Calvinism debate with Leighton Flowers last year. He's going to come on. He's going to talk about the 1689 London Baptist Confession. Just kind of let us in on just what does that mean when somebody says I'm a 1689er, and then. Does that sound funny?
It is.
I guess so. So then on Wednesday on our Gifts of the Spirit show to be continued, Michael Miller is going to join us as always on Wednesday, and we're going to do 2 weeks talking about casting out demons.
Yep.
So how do you cast out demons? What does it look like? What does the Bible say about demons and casting them out? So we're going to explore all that. So make sure you hit that like button, subscribe button, and follow us so you can get some of this great content.
Excellent, excellent. Without further ado, Sean, tell us a little about yourself and your ministry for people who've been living on a rock who aren't familiar with you, man.
Yeah, first off, I'm super honored you guys invited me on. This is a treat. I teach at Biola University Talbot School of Theology for my main gig, do apologetics. Also teach one high school class part-time where my wife teaches, my 3 kids go at a private school. And then I get to speak at a lot of conferences and events. And recently I've been doing, since COVID hit, just a ton of social media stuff. So YouTube, I'm actually on TikTok, Twitter,
Man,
Instagram.
You're on TikTok too?
You know what? My son is 17 now. When he was 16, he goes, Dad, if you want to reach my generation, you got to get on TikTok. And I thought, that's really interesting. So I'm not doing stupid dances, although now and then I do funny stuff. But there's a whole community on TikTok, and there's kids who will go watch YouTube videos and buy books and follow the content and minister to Christians, and have had a few non-Christians engage the material as well. It's just fascinating.
Wow.
That's cool stuff. So we're really interested in the apologetics works that you've done. You've got tons of stuff out there, lots of books that we would encourage our audience to go pick up. Today, we're talking about one of the books that you've written, talking about the fate of the apostles, specifically talking about the both what I'll call the history and the myth surrounding the apostles, their death, their life. Can you maybe introduce our audience to that book before we start going through some of these questions?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to introduce this. Number one is it's an academic book that came out of my doctoral dissertation at Southern, which I graduated from in 2014. So it's published in 2015 with Routledge Press. So it's an academic book, but I've been told it's very readable, even though there's the footnote and the sources. It's very readable to somebody who might not consider themselves primarily a scholar. But the story behind it is I actually was with a group of high school students. We were in Berkeley, and we had an atheist friend of mine speaking to our group. And this guy says to our group that Jesus didn't even exist. And one of my students goes, wait a minute, if Jesus didn't exist, why would all the apostles die as martyrs? And this atheist friend of mine points back at a group and he goes, give me evidence any of them died as martyrs. And the students kind of looked at me and I thought, you know what? I've heard this popular argument my entire life, but I really don't know the answer to that question. I don't know. And I needed a doctoral topic, talked with a bunch of friends, realized nobody had actually examined and brought all that together. So I could publish it. I could help the church. I'm interested myself. And that launched me down this rabbit trail of doctoral research.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's interesting. So, I mean, so many questions that we could ask. So maybe we'll do with this one. Why is the martyrdom of the apostles a significant apologetic when other religions have martyrs who die for their faith? Like, why does it matter that much? I mean, because if there's martyrs in Islam and, there's jihadists and all of this. So with the Christian faith, why does it matter?
So that's a great question, because one of the critics who's pushed back on my position is a scholar by the name of Candida Moss. And she's done some really good work on ancient Christianity, has a more popular work where she says that Christians often claim they're the only ones who have martyrs. Now, if Christians have claimed that, and I'm sure she's right that some have, that's just false. And that's not the argument that I've made. There's plenty of martyrs in other traditions, like you said, whether Islam, whether Buddhism, whether Judaism. That's not the point. The question is, what is somebody willing to suffer and die for? Mm-hmm. That's the heart of the question. And this intersects with the question of, are the apostles reliable in their testimony about having seen the risen Jesus? And their willingness to suffer and die for that belief helps us establish their credibility. So if you go back to the time of the Maccabees, which obviously predates the apostles, you have these stories of these Maccabean martyrs who are willing to suffer brutally. Why? Because they refuse to compromise the law. They would be a martyr for the Jewish law. They didn't want to compromise it. Go to, I think it was the 1970s during the, my mind just went, Vietnam. You had these Buddhist monks who light themselves on fire, dying in protest against the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. So people will die for a range of different things, but the apostles were willing to suffer and die for the belief that they had seen the risen Jesus. That's why martyrdom in Christianity for the apostles is so significant.
Somebody who says something like, well, yeah, maybe they grant it to you that they actually died for this, but maybe they were believing a lie. How would you respond to that?
Well, anybody can say anything and go, well, maybe, well, possibly. And I'd say, oh, that's an interesting supposition. Why should I believe that that's the most reasonable explanation? Mm-hmm. I'm not going to let somebody just throw out their hypothetical possibility and put the burden of proof on me to disprove it. I'm going to say, that's interesting. Why do you think they died for a lie? Because I want to know, when I look at why people are willing to suffer for certain things, a lie is not typically what's going to motivate an entire group of people to do so. You know, one of the people, a good friend of mine, J. Warren Wallace, former atheist, he's a cold case detective, and he wrote a book called Cold Christianity, which is a popular level book. Oh yeah, and he's never lost a case over 25 plus years of being a detective. And he said all the cases that he did were based upon one of three things: either sex and lust, power, or money and greed. Power, sex, and money. That's why people tell lies, and that's why they commit crimes. We start looking at the apostles. You don't see any of those. It wasn't about power. Jesus was like, pick up your cross and follow me. If you want to be first, you need to be last. It wasn't about money. Jesus died with the clothes on his back, so to speak. And it certainly wasn't about sex or lust. Jesus showed nothing but kindness and charity towards women. So anybody can say anything is possible, but I want to know why that's the most reasonable explanation. When they say we've seen the risen Jesus, we will suffer for this, and we will go to our graves in some cases for the belief Jesus has risen from the grave.
So it wasn't the gold, wasn't the glory, wasn't the gold, the girls, gold, and glory. That's
three
my,
Gs.
my old fundamentalist church. Those are the three areas that get everybody in trouble. But I liked in your book, you talked about these different categories of authority. You were like, hey, there are tons of claims throughout history that look pretty objectively true, and there are other claims that also look way more like myth. And then we have these different traditions that hold these different stories. So like you're even looking at history with a level of intellectual honesty throughout your book, where you're saying, okay, now this story, here's the story, it's believable. Here's this story, it's not so believable, and you kind of categorize it in this sort of way. And you're being intellectually honest with the history. Can you maybe walk through our audience through this to say, hey, just because it's old doesn't mean it's true, but how you came to use even these pieces that were like seem to be embellished, or maybe seem to be that like that telephone game where they tell someone the story, the details get kind of jumbled up. Why even that is a bit of significant data in your process of putting all this together?
So trying to be honest in the research is not an easy thing to do, because when I started out with this, there's a temptation to say, I want to defend the resurrection. I want to prove they died as martyrs. I want to establish that this is a good argument, because I've heard it my whole life. And even some leading apologists in the world have said their willingness to suffer and die is one thing that led them to Jesus. So there's that voice. But then on the flip side, I kept saying to myself, okay, I've got to follow where the evidence leads. Mm-hmm. How early and how strong is the evidence that they actually died as martyrs? So one of my good friends, Mike Lacona, is one of the leading resurrection experts in the world. I mean, he did a 700-page book that I used in my grad class at Talbot, Defending the Resurrection. And he has an entire section at the beginning of this talking about how you set your biases aside and how you try to come to the truth as best as possible, knowing none of us are purely, entirely objective.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had assessed these different apostles, all 12 of them basically, with Matthias instead of Judas. And then I added James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul. And I was looking at these assessments, trying to ask myself if I was overstating any of them, because I got pushback from one scholar who said, I think you're being too generous. So I called up Mike. I said, how do I really do this? He goes, ask yourself, would a Muslim or an atheist scholar come to the same conclusions? I thought, that's an interesting way to think about this. So I started to realize that I was being too generous, because I kind of wanted to show some of them died as martyrs. And I took a huge step back and I said, no, I have to follow where the evidence leads. And even in the case of John, I assumed John didn't die as a martyr. And I began to realize there's some evangelical scholars that think that John did. So I could have incentive to accept him as a martyr, but I'm just not convinced by the evidence. So it's easier said than done to be objective, but that's what I tried to do. And I feel pretty good about it now that the project is done.
And I think you should, because I mean there are some stories in there where you could have left out stories, like without getting too far into the interview. There are some stories where it's like, hey, there are conflicting stories of how this apostle died. And you just kind of set it on the face, like, hey, I think this one's more reliable, and this is why I think it's more reliable. It would have been to make a point for someone who didn't know history, which, by the way, is most of evangelicalism. You could have sold a lot of really convincing books that required people not to think at all if you just said, hey, this is the way this guy died, and didn't mention any other contrary story. That would have been more compelling, but you were intellectually honest. I do appreciate that in the book, that you were like, hey, we're not sure. And I think that's
but speaking of that evidence, I mean, okay, you want to set out and find out how these apostles died. I mean, if it was sitting on the surface, somebody would have found this out a long time ago and written your book before you did. Like,
right.
where are these papyri? Like, is this in some cave? Like Sean McDowell's out exploring the Dead Sea, like caves. Like, I'm gonna find where it says Peter died and how. Like,
with an Indiana Jones
where are you going to find the stuff?
Well, it really depends upon the apostle. So, for example, Peter, who's cited more than any other apostle, there's a lot written on Peter. There's some scholars like Marcus Bachmuel and others who have committed an extensive part of their life examining Peter. Now, they hadn't looked at it exactly through the lens that I was, but really with Peter, it was a matter of just tracking down articles and books and contacting scholars and bringing together the data that was out there and trying to assess it fairly. Now, you get into some of these other apostles, and I actually had certain apostles like Bartholomew. There's traditions of him going to Armenia. So I found an ancient Armenian tradition and found an Armenian student to translate it for me because it had never been translated into English.
Oh my gosh.
This was like, these are the kind of things you spend time and money assessing this because nobody had really done it as far as I could find. When you come to Thomas, what's interesting is a lot of Eastern scholars do historical research very differently than Western scholars do. And sometimes there's an elitism where Western scholars will just write off some of the scholars who defend the martyrdom of Thomas. So I'm reading these sources. I'm trying to contact some of them. That's a trick. When it came to Andrew, I found one scholar who's a modern day journalist, and he wrote an 800-page book only in modern Greek, not even ancient Greek, modern Greek, where he assessed every tradition he could find about Andrew, pieced them together, and asked if they tell a consistent story. Well, that's not in English. That's not even in ancient Greek. So bottom line is this was a much harder task that involved just step-by-step gathering and assessing and collecting. I think that I knew stepping into this.
So if you had like a one-stop shop that you'd be like, this is the place, if you want to get, maybe not get all of it, but like, hey, there, and obviously your book would be the right answer, right? But
Sure.
so yes, pick up the book, link is in the description. But for those who want to continue to reading some of this ancient literature, what would be a place where you'd say, hey, a lot of the stories of the death and the life of these apostles can be collected in a few different places? Is there anything like that out there?
There's not really one source that brings all the death of the apostles together that I would trust. Now, if I said there was a popular book, it probably would be by Brian Litfin. He wrote it probably a year or two before my book came out. And I read that book and I thought, you know what, if I was going to do a popular version of my book, that would probably be the one. And I'm forgetting the exact title off the top of my head.
Don't feel bad about it, because like when you're saying popular, you're just saying like more like for our audience, they're gonna want the meatier version with the footnotes. So like that's just we've got the nerds in the comment section. That's just know your audience, you know.
Okay, so I kind of want to let's just find out how they all died. All right, can you just walk us through the list? We got Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, Simon the Zealot, and then Matthias replacing Judas, Paul. I mean, maybe not all 14, but just maybe the quick rundown.
Well, like let's start with Peter, right? You said Peter's probably the most reliable one, crucified upside down. Did that happen?
So for Peter, we have at least 10 sources within what I call the living memory, which is basically the first 2 centuries. And some are stronger than others, but there's kind of a unanimous, consistent story that Peter died as a martyr, and good reason to believe that he made it to Rome. Now, the first, ultimately, for my case, I don't have to prove how he died. I just have to prove that he died as a martyr. Or if the evidence shows he didn't, then that helps the question that I'm asking. Well, I think here's an example of how I've actually changed my mind potentially since I wrote this book in 2015. Scholars are divided about whether or not Peter was crucified because of the reference in John chapter 20, where Jesus says, you'll be taken where you do not want to go, clothed by another. And then he says, this is to indicate the kind of death that Peter would experience. Even Bart Ehrman says, this is a martyrdom tradition. People are divided whether it was crucifixion or not. In my book, I said it probably is crucifixion and explain why. Well, a book came out afterwards, edited by Larry Hurtado on Peter. And he pointed out something that now seems almost so obvious. I don't know how I missed it. Is one thing we know about crucifixion is people were stripped bare. They were totally naked. So Peter told he would be clothed by another is exactly what didn't happen in crucifixion, which made me think he died. In fact, I forget the name of the author who wrote this in the Hurtado book, but he says he probably was burnt during the time of Nero and put on stakes, as many others were. I don't think we can prove that, but that's the example I thought, oh, that's a pretty good point that he wasn't crucified. Now, crucified upside down doesn't show up until about 180 in a book called, 180. So you're talking probably 120 years after, but still in the living memory. And it's in a book called The Acts of Peter, which is full of all these fanciful apocryphal tales of like Simon Magus, who's the villain, flying through the air, and Peter doing these drastic miracles that go beyond anything in the apostles, in the Gospels.
This is something like a Marvel film, like lightning comes out of Peter's hands.
Yeah.
And no, not quite.
Almost. There's some crazy stories in these, but the romantic novels where people are trying to fill in the details historically of things we don't know, but they also contain a historical core in these stories as well. Well, that shows up where Peter is crucified upside down. Well, what's interesting is later church historians pick up on that as historical. But some scholars I read say, actually, what's going on here is Peter is upside down because when he's upside down, he actually sees the world as it is. And his death, like the death of Jesus, will help turn the world upside right. So it mentions him crucified upside down, but it was for a theological reason, not a historical reason. Now, that said, we do have precedent of some people being crucified upside down, so it's not impossible. But in the book, I kind of say, you know what, I'm not convinced by it. If I had to argue, I'd probably say against it, but it's certainly possible. By the way, one last point. Think about this. You know the story, the way it was told, because I told people the same story. Peter was crucified upside down because he's so humble. He requested they not crucify him like Jesus, right? Have you guys heard that story?
Oh, yeah, I've heard it.
That's the way it's told. Well, let me ask you a question. You think the Romans took suggestions about how you want to be crucified? I mean, honestly.
No. He's getting beaten, shoved around. It's like, hey, guys, would you do me a solid? Like, upside down, please. Like, no.
Right? I think it's crazy when you think about it. So it's possible, but I think he died as a martyr. I think we're on very solid ground for that. But exactly how he died, I'm a little less confident.
Okay, so
okay. So we've got 13 more, though. Not that you have to do them all, but give us a few highlights
in alphabetical order.
Okay,
no, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, right. Here's the deal. I think we know how 4 of them died with confidence.
Okay, let's go with those 4.
Let me frame this. 2 of them more plausible than not. The remaining 8, I don't think we even know. So we don't have to walk through all of them.
We don't know how they died, or we don't know whether they died.
Well, I think we know that they died because we're 2,000 years removed.
Well, yeah. Okay, there you go. That was solid.
There's some kind of like Mormon thing going on here with Michael. He's like, nah, they're still kicking
somewhere.
No way. They're still
here. Yeah, but you don't know that we don't know that they're martyred, or we don't know how they were martyred.
Yes, I think that's right. Whether they were martyred or died a natural death, there's conflicting stories.
Gotcha.
So another one we could jump to is Paul. I think for Paul is probably the second most substantiated death. There's probably 8 sources in the 1st century and 2nd century that tell a consistent story that Paul was put to death. Now you get to some of the later traditions and they'll mention that Paul, like in the Acts of Paul again, was beheaded. Well, for someone who is a Roman citizen, and given that that was a common means of death, that's a very reasonable explanation about how Paul would have died. Now, I'll tell you something interesting about Paul is in the Acts of Paul, it describes when he's beheaded, this milk-type substance secretes from his neck. Well, when I first read that, I'm like, that's totally fiction. They're saying his life is like sustenance and is, like milk is nourishing. And then this doctor sends me a document, and I still need to track it down, about how a common phenomena under extreme stress when this milky type substance actually secretes from the neck. Well, I'm not sure we can prove whether that happened to Paul or not, but it was enough for me to pause and be like, that's actually kind of interesting. And that's what makes this investigation so hard, is how do you separate history from legend? Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's probable, sometimes it's just impossible.
Does the legend have anything to teach us, though? Like, I think you mentioned this in your book. Like, there are some of these events that take place, and you're like, pretty sure that didn't happen. Actually, almost everyone's pretty sure that didn't happen. But when we read it, is there nothing in this that we can learn from it? Like, what does the myth, the legend, the epic of it all, is there anything in that we can glean from that as Christians looking for like objective truth?
Well, almost all of the stories of the deaths of the apostles are showing that they're favorable witnesses and they follow the example of Jesus.
Okay.
That's the main takeaway. So even with Paul, we have a source at the end of the first century, a writer named Clement of Rome. And he describes kind of running this race of faith. And Paul is the greatest example of endurance. So when Clement describes the martyrdom of Paul, he's not looking at this as a historian or an apologist. He's looking at it differently, describing the lessons we can take away from it of what it means to live with endurance. And Paul, who of course was told in Acts he would be the apostle of suffering, describes it in 2 Corinthians 11, goes full circle, dies as a martyr, completing the call that Jesus had in his life. Those are a lot of the kinds of takeaways that we have at their deaths. Although the milk one, I really feel like I could only kind of guess on that one. I'm not really sure.
Sure.
So I want to put you back in the scenario that introduced the whole conversation. In fact, introduced the idea of you writing this dissertation, which ultimately became a book, which was the atheist saying, nobody can even prove that any of these guys were martyred, right? So with the rigor of a historian, you're able to say, and an academic, you're able to say, okay, 4 for sure, we can definitively say. 8, I think you're saying, or 8 or 10 if we count all of the 14 you examined, less definitively. Now, if my numbers are right or wrong, correct me. Do you feel like that 4 gives you a weaker case against that atheist? Do you feel like, okay, I mean, were you disappointed in the end? Like, man, I kind of thought they would all for sure be martyred. Or is it more like, you know what, it might not meet the sort of rigorous academic standard, but I actually think they were all martyred, and it just, I can't write that as an academic. I mean, kind of just take us there. How would you respond to that?
So one of the hardest parts for me of doing a dissertation was coming up with my rubric and grid for how I would assess the apostles historically. Once you have that in place, it's a matter of doing research and plugging each apostle into the system that you've set up. So I came up with a 10-part scale from the least historically probable to the highest historically probable. And then based upon the quantity and quality of the evidence, assessed each apostle. So as you go down, those 4, I would say, without nuancing exactly whether they're 7 or 8 or 9, I think Peter, I think Paul, James, the brother of Jesus, and James, the son of Zebedee, we have high historical confidence that they died as martyrs. I think Andrew and Thomas, at least a case can be made that they're more plausible than not. And I always hesitate to put numbers on that, but that might be like 51% confidence, the slightest bit more than probable. I think all the others, I think that's the 8 remaining, we don't really know if they're true or false. So like Bartholomew, the story of Bartholomew is that he was skinned alive. Well, the earliest evidence I could find was from about 500 AD for that tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's not false because it shows up then, but we have to realize that that's a very weak case. Plus, I found Bartholomew stories of him like being stabbed to death, burned to death, crucified, beheaded, drowned to death. And I started to think, you know what, there are so many competing traditions. I don't even know how to assess which one is true, if any of them.
Yeah.
So for me, I guess you could say during the dissertation, there were some moments of disappointment, but overall, I had determined myself going into this that I want to know what is true. I didn't want to make an argument just for the sake of making an argument. I really wanted to know what happened to these different apostles and how strong the tradition was. Now, the reason I wasn't overly disappointed is because I think more careful apologists, people like Gary Habermas and people like even Lee Strobel is very careful. He's a popular apologist, but he's very careful to frame it this way. He would say the willingness of the apostles to suffer and die doesn't prove that Christianity or the resurrection is true. It helps establish their sincerity, which is a part of a larger resurrection argument.
Yeah.
So all you got to do is read the beginning of Acts 4 and Acts 5, and
That's
you
good.
see their willingness to suffer for this. So I had a conversation, interestingly enough, on a trip to Israel with a bunch of apologists. William Lane Craig was there, and he said, we don't even have to establish that any of them died as martyrs. We just have to show they believed Jesus had risen from the grave and were willing to suffer for that to show their sincerity. And I said, I think you're right. But if we can show that at least some of them died as martyrs, and I think we can, that just adds to the case itself.
Yeah. And, of the names that you mentioned, James, the brother of Jesus, to me, that's like radically the most convincing.
Sure.
I have two brothers. There's literally nothing in the world that would convince me like your brother Matt, he's the Messiah and he rose from the dead. I'd be like, no. I love Matt. He's so cool, but he's not the Messiah. There's literally nothing that could convince me of that. For James to go there and be like, yes, the bro I grew up with, wrestling around on the floor growing up, is now the Lord that I worship. And I'm willing to die for it. That's pretty convincing.
Now, you said both of the James stories are very compelling, that you can make a strong case that both of the Jameses died. A strong case. You said maybe not as definitive as Peter and Paul, but with the other two, with the Jameses, I remember reading, I forget which one it was, that there is a conflating story. One of them was stoned, but then there's a story of him being thrown off the top of the temple and then beaten to death. So even with that, you've got these conflicting stories. What gives you this confidence to say that, man, for sure he was martyred, though?
So that's a reference to James, the brother of Jesus,
Okay.
who was not one of the 12. But in 1 Corinthians 15, we're told that Jesus appeared to the apostles. Mm-hmm. He appears to, the 12, the 500, to Paul, and also to James. And in Acts, we see he becomes one of the leaders in the early church. What's interesting about James,
Paul calls him an apostle, right? Like in Galatians?
I think
yes.
1 Corinthians 15 refers to him as an apostle. Yeah, I think in Galatians too.
Yeah, so in Galatians, he's like, I didn't see nobody except for James, the Lord's brother. I'm pretty sure he says that. Didn't see any of the apostles. And then he calls him that. Anyway.
Okay. Anyway.
I digress.
No, that's okay. This is actually important. So keep in mind that Luke and Paul use the term apostle differently for the most part. Okay. For Paul, an apostle is one who's seen the risen Lord. So that would include James. That would include himself. He says, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the risen Lord? 1 Corinthians 9:5. Luke, in the Gospel of Luke and Acts, tends to use apostle referring just to the 12. So these kinds of things made my research difficult.
We may have to invite you back on another episode. We have this debate all the time.
We're always talking, because we'll have Tom Schreiner comes on the show, talk about apostles, and is like, yeah, there's a technical sense of apostle, and there's this other sense of an apostle, and it's
yep.
he'll kind of walk us through it, and people can go back and watch some of those episodes if they're interested. But I keep getting you off your train of thought. Keep going.
No, that's okay. I apologize if I'm nuancing stuff too much.
You're great.
So James, the brother of Jesus, what's so fascinating about him is we have three different kinds of sources for his death. Number one, we have a Jewish source from Josephus towards the end of the first century in Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus talks about during this political debacle with Ananias, James, the brother of Jesus, is put to death. And I believe it mentions that he, gosh, off the top of my head, I'm forgetting if it mentions that he's stoned to death or killed with the sword. I think maybe it mentions he was killed with the sword. But he definitely mentions that he was put to death during this time. So you have this Jewish source, the end of the 1st century. You get in the 2nd century, you also have these Gnostic sources, like these apocalypse type of documents, and they mention the death of James. And then you have Christian sources like Hegesippus in the middle of the 2nd century that also mention the death and martyrdom of James. So what makes that so unique is you have 3 competing worldviews that agree on his martyrdom, even though there's some disagreement about was he killed with the sword, was he stoned to death? Actually, it wasn't the sword. Was he stoned to death? And then was he pushed off kind of this ledge you see showing up later in the Temple Mount in Hegesippus into the 2nd century? So one of the things I do in the chapters, I talk about how these are not necessarily contradictory. There's ways to make sense of these. When you understand the way somebody was actually stoned to death, what it meant to be pushed off a ledge, they're not necessarily contradictory, but they're highlighting different emphases. Or it's really possible as you get into the 2nd century, you have this Christian tradition that does mention his martyrdom and retains that historical core, but they add certain kind of apocryphal things about James to make him look a certain way that doesn't totally discount the source as having some historical value, but might introduce some things into his martyrdom that are not as established historically speaking. So bottom line, you're asking a great question that gets to the difficulty of knowing truth from error. But when you have 3 relatively early different kinds of sources that agree on the broad martyrdom of James, no contradictory accounts, I think we're on pretty solid ground to conclude that he in fact died as a martyr.
That's good.
Okay. Talk to us about John, okay? Because we've got John, this statement in John chapter 21, I believe it is, where, you know, this conflict over will he be alive until I come, and it's kind of ambiguous. And then you have the tradition, it's like he was dipped into a pit of burning tar and they couldn't kill him. He
was
oil, whatever it is. So they sent him off to Patmos because he was unkillable. So he's on exile. And then he wrote Book of Revelation,
like Wolverine,
which is like a whole nother deal. So maybe you can help us settle on the date of Revelation. And so just talk to us about John. Help us solve this mystery.
He's old man Logan. He's like, can't kill me now, but old age.
Exactly,
Only old age is going to get me.
Well, I'm not going to pretend that I can completely unravel this for you. I just had a scholar this week send me an article, and he goes, here's my case for the martyrdom of John. And I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But there is one of the cool things about writing a book is you have these people contact you in their research and say, consider this, if you thought about that. And it's just this ongoing conversation. But I'll tell you, when I started this research, I was convinced that John died a natural death, and that the others, the story was they died as martyrs. But the question is, what does the evidence point to? It never really crossed my mind that John died as a martyr. Well, as I dive into this, I find scholars like Ben Witherington, a great evangelical scholar.
He's been on the show.
Richard Bauckham, a great evangelical New Testament scholar. Both of them argue that John the Apostle died as a martyr for different reasons.
Whoa.
Now, this raises a ton of questions about who then wrote the gospel, who wrote Revelation. Are there 2 different Johns? I dove into this thing and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is more involved than I ever dreamed. Now, why would some people say John died as a martyr? There's internal evidence and there's external evidence. The internal evidence would be that John is all over the beginning of the book of Acts traveling with Peter. And then he disappears because in Acts 12, James, his brother, is martyred. You get to Acts 15 for the Jerusalem Council. John is nowhere to be found, never mentioned again, because he died as a martyr. That's one argument. The second one is when James and John are walking with Jesus on the road. They're walking on the road together and they say, can we reign with you on your right hand and your left, you know, in all your glory, so to speak? And Jesus says, can you drink the cup Now, there's debate about what that means, but there's a number of scholars that I read who said the most natural interpretation is it's not just the cup of suffering, it's the cup of martyrdom. And Jesus says, you'll be baptized with my baptism and you will drink the cup. Well, we know what happened to James. The argument is that it happened to John. That's the internal evidence. Now, the external evidence are church calendars that start showing up in the 3rd and 4th century. That's really where you see this. And then a reference to a historian named Philip of Cede, who gives a quote, and this is, if I remember correctly, I think in the 5th century, he quotes Papias around the turn of the 2nd century, referencing the martyrdom of John. Now, Eusebius, who wrote before Philip of Cede, didn't include that quote. And scholars that I've talked with don't think that reference by Philip of Cede is genuine. But the point being, if it were, and we had a citation from Papias, early 2nd century, that would be powerful confirmation. So, bottom line, it was enough for me to pause and go, this is interesting. And there's something here. Not be persuaded by it.
Sure.
So one more point. So why do we have these stories? There's 2 that I found. One of John drinking poison and not dying. Another one of him being dropped into the oil and not dying, which first shows up in Tertullian, kind of the turn of the 2nd, 3rd century. I have a theory for this. I can't prove it, but I think there was some awareness of Jesus saying that both James and John would drink his cup and be baptized with his baptism. So to show that Jesus wasn't a false prophet, they put him through the process of martyrdom, but he ends up surviving instead of actually dying. Now, I can't prove that, but it's unique and interesting. We have those stories just for John. Given those statements, that's what I suspect.
Okay. So I've got a question surrounding about surrounding the use. You mentioned the Gnostic writings, and you mentioned the fact that they were from such a different source, but they still had the same historical data that they made this kind of confirming point. Now most Christian scholars and people in our audience will hear us talk about Gnostics in kind of a negative, pejorative way, and rightly so, because we've got a charismatic background, and we always want to make sure that it's like, hey, yeah, this, not
but
that.
We're not Gnostic.
Right.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
this and not that, and helping keep this in the historicity of it all. Can you explain to us like why using a Gnostic source, just I guess doubling down on that point of why it would be important to use someone that would actually be an opponent to the Christian faith as an authoritative historical source, so that it wouldn't be necessarily confusing?
Yeah, I think this is true in a court of law. If you have somebody who's not sympathetic to your view, maybe an enemy affirming something in your case, then you want to cite that person as giving strength for your case. That's one reason why. So the Gnostics, there's debate about exactly when Gnosticism arises, but we certainly see it at least in the 2nd century. And there was more of a split between the body and between the soul, between the Old Testament view of God, the New Testament view of God. It really was one of the first heresies that you see Christians battling. And some would argue you even see in John him addressing some of this, because it's written later, talking about the Word becoming flesh, and other writings in 1st, 2nd, 3rd John challenging Gnostic ideas. Whether you buy that or not, it was considered heretical. It was an enemy kind of view that now we have a Jewish scholar, Josephus, was not a Christian. We have Christian writers in the middle of the 2nd century, and you had these Gnostic views who are considered heretical, supporting on this broad tradition of the martyrdom of James. That just adds to the strength and depth and scope of the case for his martyrdom. All these things are kind of cumulative. How much do you have? What's the quantity? What's the quality? You have to assess it. But that was the only apostle that I could find a Gnostic source for of any value that helped corroborate the death.
Okay. Hey, I'm curious how atheists have received your work. Once you put it out there, you mentioned one critic, and I think it was a female. I can't remember her name. Someone who's critical toward it. But anyway, how have atheists responded?
So I've gotten a range of different views, not just from atheists. In fact, I have this book sitting on my desk from a leading New Testament scholar. And he's certainly not an atheist, but he kind of criticizes Christian apologetics. And in a live Q&A just 2 days ago, somebody's like, hey, have you responded to Dale Allison yet? And I've got the book right here. It's called The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemic, and History. And he cites me on a couple pages and offers a critique. I literally haven't even had a chance to read it and respond yet. Part of me is just honored that he would include my work in his response to Christian apologetics on the resurrection. So that's nice to see it just popping up on the radar of one of the leading scholars of our day. Even if he thinks I'm wrong, being taken seriously in those circles is a positive thing. As a whole, I think the pushback I've gotten is more around the edges, but not at the heart of it. Like some people said, hey, rethink this about John, rethink the nature of the death of Peter. Just got a book I'm looking at over there on Thomas that looks like it's making an even stronger case for the death of Thomas, Reese's scholarship over the past 5 years. So as far as what I've seen, people have challenged some of the basic details around it, but the premise that I'm arguing for seems to still be sound. And I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from scholars who, I don't know if they're atheists, but are certainly not conservatives and evangelicals. Now, I guess there's a difference between how scholars interact and if you go on YouTube or blogs.
Yes, we've noticed there is a difference. Yes.
There's plenty of people who've done responses and are just like, Sean doesn't know anything. He's an idiot. It's false. I don't even read that stuff because they're not charitable and they're not serious. I don't mind a critique from someone who's not a scholar. I've had debates with a YouTuber named Apologia who's not a scholar, but he read my work. He took it very seriously, did a video response. We had a discussion together, and I think it was a fruitful conversation. I just don't have time for people that are name calling and not taking arguments seriously.
No.
That's the best I can tell.
We sympathize. Yeah. So we'll have, an N.T. Wright, a Tom Schreiner, a Wayne Grudem, a Sam Storms, Michael Heiser, James White, and they're remarkably kind 90% of the time. It's just when you touch that 10%, you touch that hobby horse, and then something comes out. You tell Heiser there's no such thing as Nephilim, No, seriously though, he's coming on in a couple weeks. I'm just picking on him. John Jeremiah said he has this question about martyrdom. Was it just this mark of piety by the time of Irenaeus, and did that lead to an improper focus on this asceticism and kind of causing the martyrdom stories to kind of like flourish in the mythos of these stories for embellishment, for the sake of proving the piety of these individuals who died as martyrs?
We do see some of that emerging, and that's what becomes the difficulty in what's history versus what is just a matter of this romantic invented story. So yes, that makes it hard. I think most scholars would agree that the stories don't become completely untethered from history until you get into the 4th and 5th century. Then the historical core is gone, and it's like people can just make up anything they want to almost about the apostles, not rooted in history. So I affirm that this question is partly what made my research difficult in assessing truth from just piety, the way he described it.
I mean, what do you make of the fact that there has been a lot of legendary story creation? I mean, is this true when you look back in history, whether it's Christian or otherwise, or are Christians particularly gullible, like we just make stuff up about our heroes? I mean, what do you make of that?
So I'm not an expert on other religious traditions, so I somewhat hesitate to comment on it, but my suspicion as I've studied, for example, Islam and read some early sources, you see plenty of invented stories about Muhammad. For example, in the life of Muhammad, one of the earliest biographies about his life that clearly, I think a bunch of those are legendary and invented. So my suspicion is it's not unique to Christianity, but I haven't studied all the religions in the same depth as I had with Christianity. One of the difficulties here is as these cities are founding, if they could have a martyr that's one of the apostles found their city,
No doubt.
then there'd be a certain authority to that city. And so it's not like
Rome, for instance,
it's
maybe.
not like, well, yeah, Rome's obviously a big one. And it's not like these are nefarious, evil acts. I think they're trying to say, look, the church is good. We hear stories about this. Let's tell this story, even though it maybe couldn't be grounded as much historically as we would like.
Yeah. That's good. Well, I want to honor your time. I know we've only got 6 minutes before we wrap up. So we do this one thing that we do at the end of the show, Sean, is I'm going to toss it around for kind of closing thoughts. I'm going to ask Michael to give some of his closing thoughts. We'll toss it over to you, and then we'll close out the show. So what's that one golden nugget you want people to walk away thinking about, meditating on, maybe reading as they're thinking about the death of the apostles? Michael, starting with you, sir.
Well, I think on one hand, we have the value of critical thinking. And Sean, what I just respect about you is the way that you went about this approach, that it's the goal is not to prove my side is right per se, although we certainly desire that, but to actually get at what is the truth. And there's a lot of legend that rises up, and we've got to sift through that. But as Christians who worship him who is the way, the truth, and the life, we have to care about truth, all truth. And so anyway, just really respect what you're doing, and I think you model for us critical thinking and what that's supposed to look like.
Excellent. Sean, give us some closing thoughts so people walk away kind of that one thing that you want them thinking about, meditating on.
I appreciate that, Michael. While I was doing my research, a pastor said to me, he goes, gosh, you're going to make a liar out of all of us. And I said, my goal is not to make a liar out of anybody.
That's funny.
But we have formulated this argument not being as careful as we could be.
Yeah.
And now with so much information, there's so many skeptics and atheists who've rightly said, wait a minute, this is not a good argument, even apart from that. So how do we frame the argument? Here's what I think we know. The apostles claim to have seen the risen Jesus. There is no early Christian faith apart from the belief that Jesus had risen from the grave and appeared to them.
Amen.
They are willing to suffer and willing to die for that belief. There's no evidence any of them recanted. And we have good reason to believe that at least a handful of them died as martyrs. This helps establish their sincerity, that they're not liars, which is a part of a larger case for the resurrection that we can look at, which involves other facts. So let's use this argument. I think it works, but let's use it carefully and accurately and not overstate our case.
That's good.
Amen. Yeah, and we can get a lot of trouble just overstating stuff because we'll say something that's true, but if we overstate it, make it more of an emphasis on it, you get caught in this lie, and that kind of undercuts your whole argument. Things fall apart quickly. You'll see there in the lower third, I dropped down a graphic for Patreon. If you want to join on Patreon, you can go through this book with us on the Kingdom of the Cults by Walter Martin. It's really exciting. We're going to go through the chapter on Mormonism this week. So read up. Saturday, we're going to gather together, do a live conversation. We're going to gather together, discuss this chapter on Mormonism. It's going to be exciting. I really enjoyed the conversation. My wife has dived into this. I think she might be video chatting in from Virginia because she's read the chapter on Mormonism. She's been watching a couple documentaries, getting really into the apologetic space there on this subject. We don't do a lot of apologetics here on Remnant Radio. We want to interview different pastors and teachers for different churches and denominations talking about theology. But man, it's a fun exercise. I mean, to know about the Christian faith is to defend the Christian faith. So it kind of goes one in the same. So guys, thank you so much. If you like this
make sure
episode,
you subscribe to Sean McDowell's channel. He's got some great stuff coming out. So check out what he's got on his channel.
Yeah, you can just search him on YouTube at Sean McDowell.
Or TikTok.
Or TikTok him. Because that's what the cool kids are doing these days. But you guys, we'll see you tomorrow. We've got Joel Webben on live at 4 p.m. talking about 1689 London Baptist Confession. So we will see you soon for that. And Sean, thank you so much for coming on again.
Thanks for having me. You guys are pros.
Blessings, guys.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.